I'd like to introduce Paul Guthrie. Paul is going to chair this session, and then he will introduce the other panel members in turn. Paul is a senior economist and business development lead at the Tauri Group. He's an expert in the commercial space markets and a multidisciplinary technology investment management. He has conducted analysis for senior NASA leadership, consulted for many of the leading aerospace firms. Paul holds master's degrees from the Johns Hopkins University in Applied Economics and the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and in international space science and technology policy. Paul is a former member of the United States rowing team 2003-4, a Pan American Games bronze medalist in 2003, and has won 5 national championships as an Olympic development rowing coach. Now there is a team sport that you could all study. Welcome, Paul. Turn it over to your team.
It's a real pleasure to be with the people on stage that I am, and I want to introduce them quickly, and then I want to say a couple words about why I think this topic is so important and a little bit about the topic. So we have Chris Boshuizen, who's the co-founder and CTO of Planet Labs. Planet Labs is a very interesting, innovative company. They provide frequently updated maps of the entire planet by launching its own constellation of Earth imaging spacecraft, and they're sort of very small, and there's some interesting ways that constellation is going to unfold. Prior to this, Chris was the innovator in residence at NASA Ames Research Center. He worked on a variety of projects. He founded Singularity University, solved some key technical challenges with the Ames lunar lander concept, forged a variety of commercialization agreements for lander technology, and created the Phonesat project, which successfully placed 3 smartphone-based satellites in orbit this year. So it's great to have you, Chris. Dr. Makenzie Lystrup is the space science manager in Ball's Aerospace Arlington, Virginia office. She has a PhD in astrophysicist. She moved to Washington, D.C. After she was a research scientist at the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics in Boulder, Colorado. Prior to joining Ball, Dr. Lystrup was a Congressional Science Policy Fellow working in Congress, sponsored by the American Institute of Physics. She serves as the chair of the American Astronomical Society Planetary Science Policy Committee and as the vice chair of the Suborbital Applications Research Group, SARG, which is affiliated with the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. She's also an affiliate faculty member for George Mason's University School of Physics. And finally, last but not least, we have Cassie Cloverdance, who's the manager of business development for the Sierra Nevada Corporation Dream Chaser space system. She previously served as a systems engineer, risk manager, configuration manager, and coordinator of external communications for the Dream Chaser program. She worked formerly in media and public relations at SpaceX and began her career as a propulsion engineer at Marshall and Kennedy. She has a master's degree, or holds a master's degree from the University of Colorado and a BS from the University of Iowa. She also teaches graduate courses. So thanks for everybody for being here. Like I said, it's an honor to represent you. There's been a lot of talk of this conference about innovation, as there often is, and it's sort of one of the themes, and we're going to talk about fostering environments, or we're going to talk about creating environments that foster innovation. I wanted to put a little bit of context around this. Why is innovation so important? We kind of inherit this word from other industries, from media, but we don't always think about the particular reasons why it is so essential, and sometimes it's important to really take a step back, drive those reasons inside so that we're reacting to the actual reasons rather than reacting to just a buzzword or a concept. I want to talk about 3 things briefly that's so important about it. Number 1, innovation is one of the key things that drives economic growth. So you can use a lot of fancy terms for what causes economic growth. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's year to year being able to do the same thing for less money. That's the fundamental thing that drives economic growth. So think about that. Think about that in terms of the systems that we have, how we cost those systems, how much they cost year to year. And that's really important for how we actually grow the space economy and how the space economy contributes to the American economy as a whole. Secondly, we face a lot of competition. We compete with each other, and innovation is very important for beating each other. It's also important for staying on top of other industries. We've seen industries flow into each other very, very commonly. Who would have thought Apple would be a cell phone manufacturer 10 years ago? And this happens over and over again. So we're competing against other industries. We're competing against ourselves. We're also competing against other countries. It's important not to stand still and to keep doing things better and better every year. to do new things and to do the same things for less money. And finally, the world changes. If we have a culture of innovation, we're in a much better position to adapt to the world as it changes. Nations go up and down. What people care about changes. Technology changes culture. Innovation is really important for tracking those changes so that we continue as an industry to be very, very relevant with what's happening around us. In the space industry, we can look at innovation in other industries. We can talk about innovation in Silicon Valley, so on and so forth. There's a couple of things that are different about the space industry, so it's really important to have these types of conversations where we just look at what we do and we look at what our experiences are, and we maybe benchmark that to what's happening outside the industry, but it's important to have these conversations internally. Fundamentally, we face more complexity than almost any other industry. We have systems that are extremely expensive, extremely high-tech, a ton of interrelated systems. And you can understand how that is qualitatively different from, say, running a flower shop. There's just a million different things going on, and you have to have a handle on all those things. And normally when you have a very large technology like a satellite, there's not just one company that's working on that. There's thousands of companies that have contributed parts to that. So that's just an enormous amount of complexity. And secondly, the other important thing is quality. So one of the things that drives me crazy is printers. These things never, ever work. It's a very old technology. It's probably the least reliable consumer technology out there. We just don't demand quality from printers. But every year they get better, we buy them, we buy printer cartridges. That's just not an option in our industry. Things absolutely have to work. A lot of them are mission critical, and even if they're not mission critical, the amount of resources that go into developing them that could be used somewhere else just means that their failure is not really an option at all. So how do we create environments that foster innovation? I want to turn this over to our panelists, who have each, despite being reasonably young professionals, they have accomplished a lot, and they have experienced a number of different contexts in the industry. And so we're going to just do an initial talk about what we have seen in the industry, what their experiences have been, how we've seen innovation work in different contexts in different organizations, for good and for ill. Pass it on.
Hey, thanks, Paul. As Paul said, I'm Cassie Cloverdance, and I've had a variety of different experiences within our industry and some outside of our industry. Our first task is to go down the line and talk a little bit about the different places we've worked and what the environment was like there, what the culture was, and the expectations. I started my career at NASA, first at Marshall Space Flight Center and then Kennedy. I had a very, very good experience. I had a lot of support and a lot of guidance. Through those times, they really encouraged education and moving through different groups so that you really understood the system as a whole. But that said, I know most of the folks here have probably worked for NASA or on a NASA site through a program, and it's very regimented. You know how many hours you need to be there and what very specifically your job is. And that's kind of how I thought this industry worked with those two experiences as the first thing that I did out of college. Then I went to graduate school and realized that that's not necessarily how everyone works. I did a fellowship in DC working for the National Space Society and Commercial Spaceflight Federation. And that was more about environment, about putting yourself at the right place in the right time, getting involved in your community. That was a very interesting dichotomy to the NASA experience. Then to take that a step further, I went to work at SpaceX after graduate school. And as Gwen and other folks here can attest, that's a lifestyle. And SpaceX has actually become known for that. It's something that you live and breathe. It's your passion, and it's something that it becomes a very high priority in your life. So that was a very interesting experience. I learned a lot, and I really appreciated to be able to grow into that way as well. After I left SpaceX, I actually worked at the mall for a little bit. I moved back to Denver, and I worked at Anthropologie. It was a very interesting experience because, the minute you walk into a place like that, you turn it on. You are fully invested, but the minute that you leave, you're gone. But while you're there, you can really become sort of a different version of yourself, a very service-focused. And you'll see where later in life that helped shape my career, actually knowing how much I appreciated the customer service aspect. And then finally, I landed at Sierra Nevada Corporation, which for me personally is a great mix of all of these experiences that I've had. It's certainly a lifestyle, but the way that they've shaped that is a very family focus, a lot of work-life balance, but still you choose to be dedicated to your program and go above and beyond. So it's been an interesting evolution for me, and I know that definitely a lot of folks have different experiences at some of the same places. But it really matters, I think, your personality and where you want your lifestyle to fall on that chain.
Thanks, Cassie.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Paul. So as Paul was saying, I have a pretty broad background, and I come from the scientific community. So in my scientific career, I have been in probably half a dozen different institutions, whether that be a research organization or in a physics or astronomy department in universities. And so I've seen a lot of folks who are trying to do very innovative science, certainly, but also trying to make innovations in the higher education STEM field. So how physics is taught, how chemistry is taught, how engineering is taught to undergraduates and graduate students. Working on the Hill, there are people. Yes, they're trying to solve problems. Many of them are actually trying to solve problems, and sometimes having to do that in innovative ways. If people who are in the minority party who don't have a lot of ability to pass bills, looking for other ways to drive the debate in some direction, and then being in industry and seeing industry's perspective. All of those places, there are a lot of very smart people who work in them. I mean, you're surrounded by very smart people. And I saw that, some departments, some institutions were a lot better at fostering really creative thinking and innovation, were better at it than others. And so what's the difference, right? Because in every case, you have very smart people, very educated, very motivated people. And, there are a number of things that I think we'll talk about, but one that I have noticed is that we're looking at cultures of meritocracy, right? Where the best ideas and the best solutions are the ones that should win. Those are the ones that should rise to the top. And I think that's important, but sometimes it can turn into a blind spot where merit can hide sometimes bad behavior. So for example, someone who gets really good results and does really great work, well, if they're a jerk, it doesn't really matter, right? Because all that matters is getting those good results. But what happens is, okay, maybe you're getting great results from that person, or maybe a handful of people whose personalities do well in that kind of environment, but you're not getting great ideas, you're not getting the best work out of all of the other smart people in your organization. And it's also hard to attract people to that kind of environment. And so I think as we see the demographics of the industry change to more closely match the demographics of our country, I think that we need to adapt and make sure that we are creating cultures of meritocracy, but cultures that really help everybody flourish and help all of our really great, talented people flourish, regardless of what their personal style is or what their personality is. And what I've seen is that, say, departments that are really open and inclusive and encourage everyone are the ones that really do produce the best ideas, and the ones that kind of have a very tolerant attitude toward poor behavior and toward bad group dynamics, they can get really good results because they've got smart people. We all have smart people, right? But I think they produce fewer really great ideas. So that's how I would open the discussion.
Cool. Thanks, Makenzie. Chris?
So it's kind of like what Cassie was saying. I think some of my earlier experiences have really shaped my approach to what I'm doing right now and how I approach innovation. So I'm actually curious how many people in the audience are old enough that their 20s was at least a decade ago. Okay. So how many people look back at their 20s with some kind of amusement of the things you were doing? The same group of people. So I'm the same. So I grew up in Australia where we only have a very, very small amount of space activity. But the media that I was exposed to had given me this view that space, at least elsewhere, was really exciting and dynamic and a lot of things were happening. So when I went to my first international conference, it was actually a very humbling experience because it was really different than I expected. And there were a lot of really smart people, but they were all as frustrated as I was. And so instead of showing up and getting my ticket to space, I ended up finding a band of people to work with together to sort of hack this problem of like, why aren't we quite doing exactly what we thought we'd be doing? And where is my 2001 space station? And so I basically spent the last decade trying to answer that question. And so my approach, instead of being really excited to join a company and start building space stuff, I entered the space industry with this sense of frustration, or at least a gap that needed to be filled, and on like a hunger to find that answer of why space wasn't quite what I thought it was. Now, maybe what I thought it was wrong, but if we have an ability to get to where we think space should be and what we want, how do we do that? So that's sort of the question I've been trying to answer. So one of the interesting things that I worked on at NASA Ames was this project called Phonesat. So the idea was, it was a thought experiment, which was, what is the absolute cheapest spacecraft that you could possibly build? And so based on a couple of offhand comments from some of my managers at NASA were saying, everything that's in a spacecraft is in this phone. They'd put it back in their pocket. So I was like, well, why don't we try that? So the interesting thing is, maybe this isn't quite as capable or as robust as a large platform in space, but it does certain things. And not only that, it does more things than spacecraft did in the 50s or 60s, maybe even in the 70s. So to think that basically a group of kids, college graduates, could scrape together enough money for a CubeSat launch, or that a single family could mortgage their house and launch a spacecraft, they have in their hands a capability that is actually greater than what the entire force of the Soviet Union was able to muster to launch Sputnik. A Phonesat, is basically Sputnik with a camera and a whole bunch of really neat sensors. So that's a really interesting world where kids could launch Sputnik. So if they could do that, if this now is Generation Y is 1957, what does the world look like in 20 more years? And so that's a question that I find really intriguing. So my current company, Planet Labs, is really just trying to answer that question. What does a commercial capability look like if you start from the cheapest possible point and try and develop an emergent capability using, benefiting from some of the launch capabilities that exist from CubeSats and from off-the-shelf technologies that are driving innovation in smartphone and consumer electronics. So I'm really interested to see where that goes and what the world looks like when there are 200 companies started by people who decided to put a phone in space. I think that'd be fun.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Chris. That was great. The way that I want to ask a couple questions of you guys, and I wanted to sort of break into kind of two different parts, and I want to tell what those parts are so that you guys are sort of clear and follow the discussion. I think that first I want to talk a little bit about vision and how people regard space and what they think is important about space. This is kind of a seemingly silly kind of softball question, but it's really important because the vision that we have for what we think space should do and what we think space should be ends up becoming the conceptual scheme through which we analyze everything that we really see in space. So we interpret everything that's happening in the space industry according to our own vision of how we think the industry should play out, what we think is important, not just in space, but in the world. And that really changes from depending on where you grow up, depending on what time you've grown up, depending on what your experiences are. So it's important to sort of understand these things. So I want to ask a very sort of simple question going forward, which is that what inspired each of you to think that it was space was what you wanted to do versus anything else? Was it that you were sort of looking at the stars and really transfixed? And I'm rare in that I used to look at the stars when I was a kid and it terrified me and I wanted nothing to do with it. So I was not, I was the opposite. I knew that somewhere, there was something up there living that was going to come kill me. I was just convinced of it, I couldn't look at it. So was it, most people don't have that experience, maybe I was just crazy. What was it that made you think space was important? Was it something that happened in movies? Was it something that NASA was doing? And ultimately answer the question, what is so special about space? Let's start with you, Makenzie.
Well, to answer your first question, I think when I was very, very little, when Carl Sagan's Cosmos was on, first sort of hearing about this idea of, the Big Bang theory and the expansion of the universe, I was pretty hooked because I thought that was just, mind-blowing, right? And so from that time on, I was really interested in space and astronomy and physics, and that kind of carried over into my, the rest of my life. But, in 1996, when the Mars Pathfinder mission landed the Sojourner rover, that was a big deal to me because it was like, wow, the solar system is really cool. And there's a lot of really cool stuff that we can do kind of in our own backyard. And that's what got me more interested in looking at, like I said, our backyard, the solar system, rather than just, the furthest edges of the universe. So that made a big impression. When it comes to people in space, though, the first time I saw 2001: A Space Odyssey, I was like, why do we not have that? Why is it shouldn't be hard to go to the moon. It should be hard to go to Jupiter, fine, but hard to go to the moon, by this point, that's kind of disappointing. So, we have, astronauts in space, that's amazing, but I never wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to go to space, but I didn't want to be an astronaut. I wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to do other things, but I didn't want to spend my life training to go to space. So that was, the space program, the human side of the space program wasn't as much of really an inspiration, I guess.
Okay, interesting. Chris?
Yeah, so actually one
And
of
you
my
touched upon this a little bit. So,
yeah, I think one of my very, very first memories is watching Cosmos as well. And it was special because it meant I was allowed to stay up after my bedtime hours. And so I really, early on, found out that this space thing, my parents, from them, that it was special. I was allowed to break the rules to learn about space. And, ever since then, I think I've just had an interest in it, and particularly saw a lot of Japanese cartoons on Australian TV. We have a lot of them. And Japan seemed to also be this really amazing futuristic country where everyone had personal robots and everyone flew flying cars, and traveling to space was very, very easy as well. And so put those two together, and I basically, in my mind, created this fantasy world where, that was routine. And so the shock when I became an adult in the workforce was that it wasn't routine, I guess. So what was the second question, Paul?
So that's sort of that's the first question, and then I guess the question is, what's special about space to you?
Yeah, so the thing I guess that is weird now is that what is space? And ultimately it's just a place, and I like to say, well, it's really just the z-axis of Earth. It's interesting that we can go forwards and backwards and left and right, but not up. So I learned to dive recently, and diving's great because you can at least go down. And so that to me is like space exploration in the sense that I get to explore the z-axis of our planet. But the other one, plus Z, is also interesting. But it's just a place. So I feel like sometimes the grandeur and mystery we put around it makes it seem more inaccessible than it really is. And so, I think, for me, a really exciting future is where space is exciting, but not different, and where we can actually go there and it's actually routine to go there. So almost taking a little bit of the specialness away from space, to me, would make it more special.
Yeah, I would say what's special about space, nothing. I want to see there be nothing special about space. It should be normal. It should be part of human activity. Now, that doesn't take anything away from sort of the wonder and the awe of it, but it should be something that is not quite so special. Because when you set up something that is special and rare and scarce, I don't see that there's much growth there. And if we want to grow human presence in space, then we have to make it less special.
Cassie, do you want to dive in?
Sure. I absolutely love the points that the panelists are making. So I was a lot like Paul, actually. My first memory of getting interested in space was waking up in the middle of the night and stealing my dad's hunting binoculars, going outside and looking at the stars. And unfortunately, I'm still friends with some of my childhood friends where they bring that up, in social settings and tell people about how they would wake up in the middle of the night, see me wandering outside with the binoculars. And it's okay, she works in space now. And thank goodness, because they'd still tell the story even if I didn't. But I then convinced my parents to let me go to space camp, and that was a huge turning point for me. I loved to be physically engaged in something that seemed so far away, and I thought that was a really inspirational moment. I knew I was hooked at that point. I actually went twice, so talk about being a nerd. But I loved it. And in terms of what is so special about space, I absolutely agree with what you guys are talking about. I want it to be something where it is a routine, it's an everyday. The thing that at this point in my life I felt is special about space is that everybody, no matter who they are, they can relate. And there's a fundamental enthusiasm for people because everyone has a story. Everyone has a story about a movie that they watched, or a question to ask, or something that they've thought about. When people find out that I work in the aerospace field, it's an instant conversation starter. I'm sure a lot of you guys have that same experience, especially when you're talking to folks that are completely outside of this realm. There's always an, oh. There's very few other industries, I think, that when people say that they work in, you immediately get a response and an opportunity to have a conversation. So at this moment, I think that's what's so special, but I would love for that to be like, oh, great, my neighbor down the street does the same thing. That'll be a really cool day as well.
Thank you, guys. One quick one. Chris, how does your professional and personal interests in space differ?
Yeah, so actually, one thing I figured out pretty early on was that if I kept sort of fixating about this sort of vision that I wanted to have for space, that I'd probably end up being really disappointed. And so I needed to find out, in a sense, separate church and state a little bit and say, what do I want personally versus what really is productive and useful to do given the situation that we have. And so, in one sense, the company that I work in my previous efforts have always been focused on trying to actually do something very productive with the technologies that we have, knowing that maybe ultimately that'll get where I want. But I feel like sometimes early on in my career and other people I meet still mix up their yearnings for what they really want with their project, and they actually encumber their efforts a little bit. So if you're carrying around the weight of your expectations, for instance, that space station is on this previous space station panel, a great example would be, it's amazing that we have people in space continuously and have had for 12 years. But a lot of that has to be loaded up with all of the extra benefits of why we're doing it. Really, the space station is one of the biggest achievements of mankind. It's the biggest example of international collaboration on a massive infrastructure project. That is a huge achievement. If we'd set out to do that, more in a more straightforward manner, maybe the results would be clearer. And so for me, I'd always try and separate out into two parcels what I'm doing for myself and what I'm really doing for the work that I'm doing and why it's important. So I think, I don't know if that quite answers the question, but trying to make sure that I'm not encumbering my work with my own expectations and vice versa, and that I spend maybe time on those equally, but be self-aware enough to know, this road will lead me maybe to a great product or to something that will bring benefit to humanity immediately. This is a longer-term play that might actually get me to space, but maybe not. So.
That's great. And I wanted to set that context a little bit because I think that everyone is driven sort of by their vision for what they want to make, what kind of changes that they want to make. And the basis of that vision is essentially the source of creativity for what you see moving forward and the changes that you want to make. When you have a vision for something, when you have a preconception or a conception, ideally, not a preconception, of the way you want things to go, it allows you to think very many steps ahead, it allows you to think strategically. And I think that it's interesting and important to hear what these panelists are saying about how they view space. It's a little bit different from what you hear at most conferences that I've been to anyway. With that sort of context, I want to move to talking more specifically about innovation. What are the elements of innovative organizations that you've seen that you really want to see more of? And I'll also give you the freedom to answer that question in the negative if that's more helpful. Go.
Well, I mentioned earlier having an environment that really allows everyone to flourish. Again, we're assuming you've got really talented people, so allowing everyone to flourish and creating a culture that allows that. One thing that I've seen at Ball Aerospace is, hiring really, really talented people and allowing them to grow into other roles, allowing them to move around, and not keeping people sort of in a box. And that means that we've got, physicists who end up, going into, systems engineering. We've got physicists who end up going into program management. We've got engineers who end up doing business development. But really allowing people to branch out and find out what they're good at and what they can really get excited about, instead of just, hiring someone for a role, they do it and that's it.
But
and,
Makenzie,
yeah.
Convince me that that's better for the organization and not just for those individuals.
Well, that's a really good point because it's not just about developing someone professionally, right, individually.
And you can give an example or something like that if that was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I'll give an example of someone who we hired originally, to do systems engineering. on one project, and she was hired, right out of undergraduate, so she was pretty young, and she's been at the company now, I think, about 13 years, and she was, she ended up sort of shifting into management roles here, in and out. She did a little bit of new business, and was successful in a lot of different roles, but she found that she was really interested in managing a large project, a large complicated project, and doing less engineering and more management. And we ended up with a really amazing program manager who has really done a lot of amazing work for us. So I think it's a matter of if you know that you're going to have, a number of different missions and programs that you're working on, maybe, in the defense side and on the science side and on the civil side, the commercial side, having the ability to get great people in the right place at the right time is incredibly beneficial. It's good for the individual. It keeps them excited about being in the organization. It keeps them motivated and engaged in the organization, but it also just produces better results for the company.
Great.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Makenzie was saying. The reason I stepped through with individual companies that I had worked for is because I want to turn back and say that they all have incredible examples of innovation. I mean, NASA is NASA. It's a worldwide phenomenon, really. I mean, we have got such an incredibly strong and well-branded space program. Truly sets us apart. We're able to do things that other folks can only dream of. Certainly, our Commercial Spaceflight Federation and other organizations such as that have really taken on an important role in knitting us all together at the decision maker level, which I think is incredible. Something that I don't think we could have predicted to be the outcome of it's such a productive organization, as it was growth. SpaceX, I don't think that we need to talk about the incredible innovation that they've brought to the commercial frontier. I think we're all fans of what they've done and continue to be excited about what they continue to do. Maybe anthropology wasn't a great example of innovation, but still a very interesting experience. And then within Sierra Nevada, I think a couple of different things that I've really enjoyed is the public-private partnership that we've been able to foster between our industry partners and between our groups at NASA, the NASA centers that we have individual contracts with. I think corporately that's been a huge asset and a great thing for our program. And then individually as well, we started as a very small program. I was number 12 on the Dream Chaser team. And as we grew, it started out as a joke that we had duties as assigned. If you were capable of doing something for the program, you did. But that really allowed us all to find our right niche. And I think when a person finds that place where they feel personally rewarded and like they are truly moving towards achieving their passion, then the company benefits more so than I think a lot of people give them credit for.
Great.
Yeah, so
Chris, want to jump in? Yeah.
I think to sort of get the innovative culture of an organization right, particularly new organization, it's important to get the right DNA to begin with. And that means, in a sense, having the right parents. And so one of the things that I find interesting is being in Silicon Valley. There's also this saying you can't improve something unless you can measure it. And being in the Valley with all of these software startups who are extremely agile and extremely fast sets a benchmark of what true agility looks like. And so we actually compare ourselves not so much to the rest of the space industry, but to the software companies that envelop us in the Valley. And so they have a lot of, there's a lot of sort of software folklore out there, sayings like release early, release often, an agile development, build what the customer wants, dog food your own technology, which is a Steve Ballmer classic saying. So we take a lot of those and we try to see what a company looks like when you use those as our own sort of benchmarks for how to operate. And so what does release early, release often look like in the space program? Maybe it means not having a long design cycle and a CDR and a PDR, but maybe it means incremental hardware development. So we actually build and rapid prototype spacecraft on an 8-week cycle and get them out either into space or out into the field for testing on an 8-week cycle. And then the ultimate flight readiness review is an actual operational test. So it's a lot of recasting how you operate to sort of look like, I guess, the kind of future you want to have. And so for us, I mean, one of the secrets seems to be to have good neighbors and to always be jealous of what they're doing and try and keep up. And so we're learning a lot from the software companies. We hire people, we train them to have attitudes. We like people who come from a software background because they have this expectation that things get out of the door, that you can rapid prototype a piece of code and ship it in a day, that you have continuous integration of web servers. I mean, people have noticed their Gmail gets updated in the background, sometimes in the middle of while you're using it. Suddenly the interface is different. What does that look like in a space context? What happens to mission operations when you can rapid prototype software and get new software up on a 24-hour cycle? It's kind of an interesting world that we're exploring. So.
That's fantastic. Thank you, guys. You've made a mess of all the questions by answering them all completely out of order by going into one another. So that's a very innovative approach. I want to, with that caveat, I want to cycle back. First of all,
We have more questions if you're running out.
that is what I wanted. Thank you very much. I was going to ask, please send in questions. What have you guys, for each of your organizations, what have you learned externally, whether from your customers, whether from your friends, whether from other industries? What have you learned that you've been able to roll into your own organization? And what was it like making that transition? So what was involved in sort of saying, this is something that I think we need to do differently? How did that process work? Where did the inspiration come from? Anyone who wants to answer?
I already answered, I guess.
You kind of did, yeah.
Well, you know, I agree with Chris. I mean, I think I dabbled in a couple of other fields in throughout my career, and since I've already spilled the beans on the anthropology one, you know, it's customer service, and being out and interfacing and having an experience with somebody that you're producing a product for, that you're partnering with, whether you're finding someone the right pair of jeans or you're trying to make sure that you have a mission operation that meets their needs. There's nothing more important to me personally than having that positive feedback and that open communication. And I think having that experience and being able to bring that to the table, both for a customer relations aspect, but then also the work that we do within our teams, the industry partners and then asset partners, and having that two-way communication, I think, really opens a lot of doors and helps everyone feel like they're working together, even if it is a true, you know, customer and salesman job.
I guess kind of on in that same vein, you know, I think those of us who care a lot about space and are kind of space geeks and like the hardware and sort of like it inherently for itself, maybe we forget that, say, our scientist customers out there or other customers out there don't really care necessarily, right? They want the information, they want the data, they want the capabilities that you can get by being located in space, but they don't necessarily care about, you know, the space infrastructure itself. They don't really want to hear about that. And so I think translating, instead of letting people know maybe all of the cool hardware that we build and all the great, you know, the sort of cool wow technology, but translating that into what problems does it solve? How does it map back to questions you want to answer? How does it map back to issues in the culture and in the world? I think that's important, that there are broader applications and implications for what we do in space, and I think we do well to communicate that part of it rather than all of the just cool technology that we build.
Great. I have a comment for you, Makenzie, and to everybody, which is to allow your people to grow. They really are your number one asset. That's how growth benefits the organization. Think about it. I have another question. Thank you for that comment. I didn't mean to smirk. Another question. How do we develop the skills or get the training/experiences necessary to be a successful innovator at whatever stage in life? From grad school or before, to having an established career. And I would further that by saying something that we talked about a little bit before, sort of what are the best talent development processes that you've seen in your organizations, the various organizations you've been in? And maybe not just processes, but also just orientations.
It comes to mind that saying that, you know, overnight success is 10 years in the making, right? And, you know, any musician or actor that seems to suddenly pop out of nowhere has really been working their ass off for 10 years to get where they want. And so I think the answer to this question is just try a lot of stuff and fail. I mean, I'd say it was roughly 10 years from the time that I first found this question I wanted to answer to when I actually found an answer. And in the meantime, I started a lot of things, a lot of which failed companies that only lasted a week, some that lasted a month, other projects that were moderately successful. But, it just, I think, and again, back to the Silicon Valley mindset, failure is totally okay. And I think the right way to actually know what a good business looks like or what a good technology looks like is to have seen hundreds of really bad ones. And so just spend time looking, tripping over things. It's like learning to walk. Tripping over is totally okay because at the end you can walk and you can run. And if it takes time, that's fine.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it harkens back to the point that you made earlier about surrounding yourself, learning from the people that are around you in varied industries, and having a unique point of view, and challenging the way that things have always been done. Taking your unique experience and your thoughts and seeing how you can make a small shift or recommend a large shift. I think that happens over time, and not every suggestion is going to be the right suggestion, but if you continue to communicate and grow from those around you and putting yourselves in new experiences, you can have a really big impact on even a large organization.
Sandy said in the last panel, she mentioned something about engineers not always being the best communicators. Maybe that was Gwen who said that. But I think that the communication skills that are required of scientists and engineers to really to help make that change is very important. So I would just say that learning how to communicate and helping your people learn how to communicate is incredibly important. And it's the skill that is maybe least evident amongst the engineers and scientists that I see in terms of just being a natural skill.
Where do you see yourself in the next 10 years? Where do you think the industry is going to go? Where do you see you going? What would you like to see? Should we make that broader so it's easier to answer?
I mean, I'm hoping that I'm following Elon in a capsule, dropping off comms relays on the way to Mars.
The thing I probably care about most is really facilitating very good science and groundbreaking science. And that's what we do at Ball with so much of our science instrumentation and science missions. It's really about making those great leaps forward in science. And I guess in 10 years, I hope that we are willing to make the investments as a country that are necessary to continue to make those groundbreaking science advancements. So I would say that's where I'd like to be, but I'm concerned with the current state of things. How long is it going to take us to get back to a place where we are putting in the resources necessary?
I'd say that, in business development for the Dream Chaser, I want to be executing that dream that we all talked about in the beginning, and where transportation to low Earth orbit, whether it's to take science or to take humans or to transfer someone on their way to a Martian mission, is routine. And we have an entire marketplace that's open, and space is part of our global economy in a way that it's not currently today.
When you guys are operating at your best, when you feel like you're doing really good work, it doesn't matter how busy you are, you're engaged, what's going on? What's creating those circumstances where you feel like you're in the flow?
And for me, I think it's really easy to get excited about my job when I get a chance to communicate about the Dream Chaser specifically. I think I found a product that really speaks to me and something I truly believe in. So when I'm communicating with someone about what we do and what we're trying to do to change the face of low Earth orbit transportation, I get energized in a way that it doesn't matter how long I've been up or how many hours I've been talking. I could go on and on.
I would say the autonomy and the freedom to exercise good judgment and sort of go forward with my work, and then having the team that I work with sort of doing their job as well. So I think it's a mix of teamwork and having that autonomy and freedom.
Yeah, I've actually been obsessed with the movie Moneyball, and it's really interesting. And I don't know if you've seen it or not, but the idea is really picking players that you can put in roles where they really do their best. And so where I feel the most excited in my work week is typically Monday, when I've been spending the weekend thinking about the team, and I take my approach to the team is more like a coach than a CTO. And I think about each player on the team and where they can be best used. And Monday's always exciting because it's like rearranging the field. And I come in and I'm like, if you just moved over to here and you did this, then this is what would happen to the company. And that is really exciting to see how people react to that, what skills they have and how their talents emerge when you put them in the right place where they can really shine. And so I'd say, coaching the team and rearranging people is probably the highlight of my week. And I get a lot of satisfaction from that, and seeing the results that my team can produce when they're playing at their best is phenomenal. So.
Do you have any organizational management insights, maybe coming from psychology or coming from an external consultant that you've worked in, or some sort of external perspective
That's
on
a very
your
leading
organization?
question.
That's been...
So I was just telling Paul earlier that we have just engaged a behavioral psychologist to come in as well. And they're just coming in on a casual basis. This is a friend of ours that we've talked to a lot. And it's actually funny how a lot of people make decisions. I mean, I recognized early that a lot of the decisions I was making in my career were based on this emotional desire to go to space rather than the rational benefits, and being able to separate those. So we're now looking at how a bit more of an understanding of psychology helps us focus the team as well, and also on the sales side, how to really understand what our customers really want, and rapid prototyping our approach to sales and product as well is really important. So we'll maybe next time I talk, I can tell you the results, because we haven't quite seen how this will pan out, but it's an interesting idea we're trying out. So.
Do you see a role for open source methods in the big picture drive for more innovation? Open source hardware or software?
No ITAR?
That's a really good question.
Again, I guess we're in the software space. I'd like to see, the entire community leveraged by, a lot more exchange of ideas, both hardware and software. So I'm really excited about the potential export reforms that might be coming through this summer. So maybe this is a, post-summer question really to see how the world looks then. But, if university groups can be exchanging source code for attitude control systems or communication schemes or image processing, that capability could bootstrap a lot of innovation. So definitely one thing I encourage everybody to do is publish, because publications, when properly, when you dot the I's and cross the T's and publish stuff and it's in the domain, people can use it. And so the entire history of science and technology was based on the communication of ideas and publications. And so definitely getting stuff out. I mean, open source really is just a type of publication. And so publish what you've got, share what you have, and help leverage, have people stand on the shoulders of the giants that you are and have new entrants to the market or students or recent graduates start from where you are, not from where you were. So I think it's really important.
Great. So Chris, you live in Silicon Valley. You're working on sort of small satellites. Makenzie and Cassie are working on sort of very big systems in sort of the more traditional aerospace sector. How would open source benefit you guys? What would the dynamic be?
Yeah, it's tough, right? I mean, there are real barriers, I think, to adopting open source. I mean, I think that we need to convince people that it is going to help competitiveness and that it's good for business, right? And I think that in lots of areas it is, and it can actually spur competition and innovation. But there are real barriers, and it's hard to see how to break down some of those, particularly when it comes to things like ITAR.
I think that something you just said about, you said competition and innovation. I think competition breeds innovation, and that's what we found as part of the Commercial Crew Program and part of the COTS program with the cargo transfer to and from ISS. I think that's been a really interesting way, and certainly that's not open source, but to be able to build on the accomplishments that we've had in one area of transportation really allows us all to move forward. And so, potentially offering some sort of open source communication or transfer of innovation, I think really could even take us a step further and quicker.
Okay. This is a really nice question. They say necessity is the mother of invention. What constraints are you trying to innovate around?
Well, I mean, on the civil science side, the big one right now, I would say, is the budget, right? There are just fewer opportunities that are out there and less money. So you can see that as a barrier. You can see it as an opportunity to try to do some things more efficient, look at, new types of, or more efficient types of, contract management and program management and oversight and mission assurance. And I think that forces you to kind of to take another look at how you fundamentally approach some of these missions. Someone I think mentioned earlier today a discovery mission, so it's a smaller class principal investigator led missions that that NASA does to the solar system. So these are planetary science missions, and they used to come around more often than they do now because of the budgets. But a great thing about those is that they are competed missions, right? So you've got principal investigators that team with universities and industry and compete for those missions, and that's an area where there's an opportunity to introduce some innovation. Because they're just going to be smaller budgets, and fitting inside of cost caps is going to be more important than ever. I think that's the biggest barrier, really. We've got great people, and so lots of great ideas and lots of great ways of building new technology, but having the money to do it is harder.
Yeah, so it's actually interesting. There's some areas, some professional areas of activity where it's possible to have really superior participants. So like tennis, for instance. You have people like Serena and Venus Williams who are really good at it. At chess, you have grandmasters who are good at chess. And I think one of the reasons is that there are rules that haven't changed. So if you know the rules, and there's a set number of, in tennis, there's only 5 or 6 different styles of serve and response to a volley. So if you master all of those types of movements with a racket, you can actually become an expert in tennis. So good results, in a sense, come from restrictions. And so my approach to constraints is to actually add them sometimes. And so rather than trying to take them away, adding them actually breeds innovation, because there's some rules that you have to comply with. So one of the ones we decided was that when we were starting to build an Earth imaging platform, we could have built a spacecraft of any size, but I decided to constrain it to a 3U spacecraft bus, which made some choices really hard. Certain things had to be thrown overboard. And that actually freed up the design space. So actually adding in constraints sometimes is useful. And so, it can go both ways, I think.
That's a good answer. Thank you, guys. What suggestions would you have for an innovation center at a university to help benefit space ideas? What technology, software, tools, so on and so forth would be beneficial?
A big library of open source code.
So there you go, answering the questions by mushing them together.
Yeah. I don't know.
I think it's a little bit of a hard question, because you are looking at a university to do something that it's not necessarily is maybe not what it's done before. I don't know. I mean, if you're talking about an innovation center at a university that's in service to the industry, to the space business, I think that is, it's a different kind of mission for a university. So, that's a good question. I would have to think about it, but I think you would have to consider what's in it for the university.
And I think the thing that you can get away with a lot in the university environment that doesn't translate very well into the commercial environment is the freedom to communicate. And if I were to do something where I was setting up an innovation center, I would bring in as many people from the outside and ask them as many questions as they let us get away with. And then once they left, take that group of students and reevaluate the questions and answers, see if there's a better way to do it, and thereby, as Chris said, stand on the shoulders of those who came before to say, okay, this is their story, this was their outcome. Certainly realizing that you don't know all the parameters that they're working in, reformulate a potential solution. And from that, I think you can leverage the growth experience that other people have. If you get that from enough folks, I think you could really go a long way to educate the people that are involved in the center itself at the university.
Yeah, but also would add more flight opportunities. So now I'd say that the number of flight opportunities for CubeSats is still lesser than the number of student CubeSat projects, probably a 5-to-1 ratio. And so if you're in a student group right now, you're usually competing for one flight opportunity, maybe with the Alana program or maybe with AFRL or something, these people who are generous enough to donate these and make these launches available, but there's not enough. So what you're actually training people on is the competitive process, not the how to build a spacecraft process. And so if the number of flight opportunities were greater than the number of projects, then people would actually fly their stuff and learn about the engineering rather than the proposal process. So I'd definitely say if anyone who has a launch capability to support students, I think is really, really important.
And I think that goes back to the budgets, because I'm sitting here as a, as
Yeah.
a launch platform, and that would be a dream come true. That would be opening space to a whole nother demographic in a way that we've never done before. And so then that circles back to Mackenzie's point about, budgets being probably the most, the largest constraint, certainly the most frustrating. I think probably I can see nods in the audience, so across the board.
Yeah.
So just a couple minutes left. I'll ask one more question. At the firm where I work, the Tauri Group, we have people from a number of different disciplines, and we think about things in different ways. And some of us have been working together for so long that you can almost provide their edits for you, so I can write something and then say, oh, well, this is what this person would do, and this is what this person would do. What is the benefit that you guys have seen from working with people who think differently and having sort of a diversity of different sort of ways of thinking within your organization as a tool for innovation?
I think it's great. I mean, I think having, a diverse palette of thoughts and ideas and ways of doing business, I think over time people grow together to have a baseline from where they work. But I think to continually refresh that architecture of the way that people are used to working and shaking that up, I think that provides a great foundation for innovation and taking things in new directions that you wouldn't have previously done.
Okay, and moving on, and can you provide examples
Yeah,
too?
so I learned a phrase recently from one of our investors, Steve Jurvetson, which is cognitive diversity. And so he's actually, now that you have a phrase like that, it's something you can pay attention to and you can look for. And so instead of thinking, well, hey, I like you, you think like me, why don't we work together? You can actually have a different lens and say, hey, you think totally differently and I don't understand you at all, but it's important you work for me. And so you can start bringing in people who think differently. And cognitive diversity, the theory goes, actually brings more wisdom, almost the wisdom of crowds to an organization. You have a different, a whole bunch of different experiences that sort of come together to actually find more interesting and novel solutions to problems. And so that's something we've been focusing on recently, is just trying to bring in people who think differently, and particularly who think differently than us, and who can help shape the organization in really powerful ways by contributing in the way that only they can. So knowing that that's a thing and that it's something you can pay attention to, I think has been very enlightening for me. So.
Yeah, I think, folks are trained to think differently from each other as well when it comes to fields, right? So I think that mathematicians really do approach problems differently than physicists do and engineers do, and furthermore, people who are trained in business. Everyone approaches a problem differently, and because education has become more specialized and people's professional lives have become more specialized, you can really start going down a narrow path of how you approach problems, and you may not recognize that you're down a narrow path. And so bringing in other people, as long as you're willing to listen to other points of view, it does help to eliminate those blind spots.
Is this the hook?
This
be
is the
one
hook.
more.
Right.
Perfect. Thank you, Wayne, for everything, and special thanks to Pat Hines for putting everything together, for putting this panel together. I'll just say that this is one of my favorite conferences in terms of how everything's put together, how good the food is, how thoughtful the agenda is, how good the networking sessions are, and it's a pleasure to take part in it, and I think we all feel the same way. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul, Cassie, Makenzie, and Chris.